We always say seat time is king, so sit on down and listen in to Motorsports Tech Talk with your hosts, Brian and Eric. Eric, how's it going?
Oh, I'm doing all right, buddy. How about you?
Pretty good. Just signed up for the second Spec Miata race at Mid-Ohio. So
Um,
looking forward to that. Mid-Ohio is a great track,
I like it.
and I definitely don't mind. It's one of the tracks I don't mind racing 3 times a year in NASA Great Lakes. Whereas NCM I do like. It's just the drive is very long. I love this. I much prefer the 2.5 hour drive to Mid Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess maybe closer to 3 at time. It depends how fast you're going, I guess. But yeah, it's because people always think Gingerman's the closest. They're like, no, Mid Ohio is actually slightly closer, I think. But that's kind of how it is.
Yeah. Every time I go, whatever navigation system I'm using has me going through some like weird Ohio back roads. So it's probably physically closer, but drive time because I'm going through something that's 45 and there's a stop sign every fucking 100 feet. It ends up taking longer. But yeah, I mean, like you said, 2.5, 3 hours. So, and the track is, as long as the weather's good, I love that track. It's phenomenal. It's one of my favorites. It's, um, you know, somewhere probably behind the full course of VIR. It's probably competitive with Road Atlanta, but I guess the point is it's a great track, So
It's notorious for its very slick rain line, or difficult rain line. I mean, basically I found it was similar actually at Audubon as well. Just the race line, because they haven't repaved in so long, is super polished from all the Indy cars and prototypes, and I mean people are racing there like all year round, all the pros and all the kind of amateur stuff too.
mm-hmm.
So it's just polished nice and smooth. So as soon as it gets wet, and then the rubber also acts kind of as like a, I don't know, like
like a lubricant.
yeah, like a lubricant, and you have to stay off the race line to go fast. So it means, and it can be tricky because a lot of times that'll be on the outside of the corner, so you have very little margin to correct if you have a little bit of a slip.
Right.
As soon as you touch that grass, you're just getting shot off potentially into the wall. So
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, it's I really had a good learning experience with that at a GoPro Motorsports Complex, the kart track down in North Carolina. Like I physically knew, right? That's the pretty standard fare is when it rains, the rain line is off the normal race line. It's a very standard approach. It's still really hard to get out of that zone though. Like even to a track I've never been before, you're just generally like, there's my apex. This is how I want to track out. And so anyways, eventually when I got a control of myself, I said, no, buddy, stay off of that. It was phenomenally better, so it's a very real thing, Except Mid-Ohio has runoff going across the track,
Yeah, that too.
They'll have pretty much creeks on the track. So that does add some spice to it.
Yeah, I've seen some people crash going down the straight because they hit those streams and it just sends them off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But one thing that helps with traction in low grip conditions.
No, what's that?
That would be a differential.
And what's a differential?
Well, I'm glad you asked because this episode we thought we'd do a little intro to diffs. They're kind of inspired by me just recently rebuilding one and throwing it in the Miata. So yeah, we just thought we'd kind of go over through the basics, different types, pros and cons of different ones, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but like, why would you, and why does a differential even exist in a car?
That's a fantastic question. They're big and heavy, and there's parts and gears. I don't want it. But yeah, I guess at the most basic, right? If you go around a corner, and we're gonna keep this super easy, steady state. Pretend you're in a horse and buggy, right? You don't have slip angle, nothing, right? Just going around a corner. You're a record, like on a record. Think of a record spinning on a record player, right? One of your tires is going to be further into the corner than the outer tire, right? So they have different radiuses or radii from your center of rotation, right? And this will all be based off the concept that with a constant rotational velocity, omega in this case. So again, let's go back to the record player. The record, it's all one fixed disc. It's spinning at a one speed, right? Degrees per second, radians per second, however you want to measure it. Well, if you think about the point that's further outside compared to the point that's further inside, in one rotation, it's going to make a longer arc. So it's traveled more than the other point. So that means its velocity is actually greater. And what this means for a car is when you're going around your corner, your outside tire actually has to turn more or rotate more than your inside tire, right? If you think of a standard vehicle layout, front engine, rear wheel drive sort of thing, this isn't a thing in the front because the two wheels aren't connected, or at least not in that manner, right? But in the rear, when you're powering them, you have axles going to each side. They're coupled together. So this differential allows your two tires to turn at different speeds. And this is while it's powering them or driving them forward. So that's a long but very dumbed down version of why you'd have one. Pretty sweet, huh?
Yeah.
So
yeah. And specifically, that's talking about, because I think a lot of times people, when they say differential, they're thinking of the full kind of assembly that you see in a car, but it kind of has, there's several different parts that are in common vehicle differentials, because the actual differential is only the little kind of the center section that's between the kind of the output of the differential and the ring gear. So in a car, usually there's it kind of, the differential is, or that kind of whole assembly has extra purposes too. Not only is it allowing one tire to spin at a different speed than another, it's also transferring the power from kind of longitudinally, or I guess down the center of the car, and shifts the power towards the outside of the wheels. So it's turning the power 90 degrees basically, since going from your engine into your wheels, and then an extra bonus of that is because you're using a pinion gear and then a ring gear, you can change that ratio to change kind of that overall gear reduction in your drive line. So
yeah, the part that you're talking about, which again, like you said, it's weird because we call the differential the assembly, right? That's very common. It's not just something weird we're doing. But specifically it is, depending on the diff that you have, it'll be the center section, spider gears, worm gears, whatever. But yeah, the functionality you're talking about is very easy to visualize if you just think about like two spur gears or gears that are 45 degrees cut. So they're axially 90 degrees from each other. That's all the ring and pinion is doing, really, right?
Yep.
Your drive shaft is connected to the pinion and it's rotating that, which, has some cool, offset and cuts, which is all a trade-off of strength and noise. But and that turns the ring, and that's how you're getting that 90-degree split, right?
Yeah. So, but I guess, but that's specifically talking about kind of your conventional rear-wheel drive differential. In front-wheel drives, there isn't a separate differential housing and assembly. It's all contained within the transmission. So in that case, yeah, it's just basically that diff insert or center section is then attached to a kind of a similar final drive ratio arrangement, except usually they're not. It doesn't have to be a 90 degree. It just can be kind of a standard spur gear pair that they're selecting the final ratio there. And then I guess the last type would be your kind of transaxle, like rear transaxle, so like a Corvette or maybe some most mid-engine cars where the transmission's in the back of the car, and so again the differential can be kind of contained within the transmission assembly. So that's usually, I guess those are the different layouts that you'll find the differential in. And then you can get, crazier with all-wheel drive cars where they'll have 3 differentials, a front, a center, and a rear in order to be able to, again, it's for the same reason you need, since you have the wheels being powered in the front and the rear, you need the outside wheels on the front and rear to now spin at different speeds going around corners. And then on top of that, then you have a split between front and rear. So, and again, that can just be caused by basically the same reason. The front of the car with the wheels being turned might have a slightly different kind of turning radius as the rear. So, ultimately, so yeah, you're just adding even more differentials in there.
All the diffs.
Yeah. So. But our kind of main focus today is on that the differential itself, the part that is allowing the left and right side wheels to spin at different speeds. So with that kind of basic explanation out of the way, we can go into kind of the different types that you'll see in cars, race cars, all different, even ATVs, everything. Everything that has at least 2 powered wheels. Anything that's not a motorcycle is going to have a diff.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So I guess we start with the problem of the standard diff, right? Or your open diff. This is what you're going to find on most cars, especially if they're not sport edition, right? It's cheap and it does the job, which is why it's pretty common. It's generally it's what we call an open diff. So this center section that we keep referring to, is attached to your ring gear, and it's got a few spur gears on it. And I mean, they allow the diff to do its job where the left and the right side can spin at different rates. The thing is, it's weird to not illustrate, but if you just take my word for it, at least for now, right? There's no reaction going on in there anywhere, right? No force or torque reaction. So what'll happen is effectively your torque path is going to be the path of least resistance. So an extreme example is if you have one tire on ice and the other tire is on asphalt. If you have an open diff, you will be stuck because your tire that's on the ice is what's going to spin. The one on the asphalt, because there's nothing reacting against the other one, that torque that's coming through is going to just be stationary because they're allowed to spin at different speeds now.
Yep.
So it's a great way to turn your car into a one-wheel drive car. So,
yeah, like if you go on YouTube and look up some burnout videos of people in like front wheel drive cars, very often you'll see them do the one wheel peels, and that's the reason for it. Once kind of one wheel starts to slip and you're using the brakes to hold the car from moving forward, it'll hold the one and then the other one just goes crazy. So
yep.
it's always funny to see those videos.
Yeah, no, it's pretty funny, and you'll see them too on. I've even seen it on. This is heavy quotes around the phrase sports cars, but like, seen them on F bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Someone will do a one wheel peel. Especially those sports cars with the lower trim engine package. They might be open, but I guess. So that's the extreme example. But now, if we start talking about being on track, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can revert to that extreme example if you're tripoding or if you pick up a tire somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Then all your power is going to go to that tire, and again, you're not going to be powered. It's in the air. It might as well be on ice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to a much less extreme case, what you're going to see is, as you go around a corner, you have some weight transfer, as we've discussed before. So you load the outside tire, the inside one gets unloaded, right? And maybe it's still on the ground, but there's a lot less normal force on it now,
Mm-hmm.
So, that's where a lot of your power is going to go. You might be able to spin that up. But I guess my point is, on track, you don't necessarily need to, dip a tire onto ice or snow to be unhappy with your open diff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then we start talking about how you get around that, and you need something to, react this torque so that it'll go to the other tire, the less loaded tire. You mentioned you were just swapping yours out in the Spec Miata. What do you use there?
So specifically, it was a lot of times people they'll call them a Torsen, but that's the brand, like Kleenex or whatever, instead of tissue, tissues. It's,
Mm-hmm.
it's an automatic torque biasing differential, or kind of a gear style limited slip. So in that case, you have a lot of basically a bunch of different kind of helical gears inside the housing, as well as there is usually a clutch that's mainly used for kind of dampening out the reaction. But basically, you're making, my understanding of it is you're kind of, it's all based on like the helix angle of the gears and how they interact with each other. But it's basically making a bias, ultimately a bias ratio that that allows up to a certain amount of torque to be like torque discrepancy between the two wheels.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if it's, I don't know what the ratios convert into like percentage, but basically based on that ratio. So say I think a Miata is around a 2.5 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
That means you can have kind of 2.5 times more torque on, I guess less grip on one side than in the other before it starts to just send power ultimately to the one with least resistance.
Okay.
So the way the Torsen, I guess one downside of the Torsen is that if you say lift a tire, it will spin that tire because it can't do 100% basically,
Right.
you know, biasing. It can only do say 80% or so. So, but what's nice about it is it's relatively kind of low wear and maintenance compared to some of the other ones we'll talk about. But it's definitely one of the most common style of differentials as far as kind of sports cars are concerned.
Yes. And it's weird, I guess, just as an interjection, from the ones I've used, and albeit they were very high mileage, right? But a lot of this ratio or this bias you're talking about is coming from these worm gears reacting against each other, right? Which gears can do just fine. They do it all the time. But a lot of the very high mileage ones I've seen, some of the gears are, worn, which is a shame. I mean, again, I think I changed the oil in mine, which presumably had never been changed before I got it, right? And my beater Miata, like 230,000 miles. So, and it's still biased, right? It wasn't junk.
Yeah.
So this isn't, a warning to anybody. But I was actually surprised to see metal chunks coming out of my diff. So
Yeah, that's one of the diffs I had gotten to use as a kind of a core for mine had the same issue. So I'm not sure what causes that. I don't know if that's people mistreating their vehicles or just high mileage or hard to say. But yeah, so it's a very popular style in most cases, as long as you're not lifting a wheel, which even when you are, that's a quarter entry, you're hitting a curb. By the time you kind of get on the power, it should have settled by then. Maybe if you hit enough of a puddle that really slows you down, or somehow you're racing on half ice, half asphalt or something, then you'd have the problem. I guess also it's not the best diff for, say, your street car when driving through, say, ice and snow. It will help, but it won't be as good as some of the other types that we'll talk about next.
Sure. Yeah,
So,
I mean,
so the Torsen, I'd say, is the most common kind of sports car diff. The most common overall is definitely the open. It's going to be your lowest cost, cheapest option. It's going to be fine for 99% of people just driving around, outside of snowy or really wet conditions. It's going to be just fine, and even in wet, it should, again, you shouldn't be having so little traction you can't get up a hill or something.
right.
But from there you get into
Well, I guess before you jump off, just because you mentioned that, it's also semi worth noting that it's I'm about to very generically address this, so it's not a universal truth, but any locking or torque biasing diff is generally going to be more oversteer prone. So for the generic population, if they're in bad weather and they don't really know what they're doing, understeers the safer route, right? It's designed into vehicles, so that's another reason why it might be used,
Yeah. So I guess you could then ask. I mean, we explained why you need a differential, but what happens if you don't have one? Well, that's those do exist. I mean, so one common way that maybe drag racers most commonly, and then some road course racers will do is they'll take their open differential and they'll weld those kind of planetary looking gears in the differential together
Mm-hmm.
Not the pinion to the ring gear.
Exactly. You weld the spiders. You weld the spider gears.
Yes.
Just those. Not the others. Let
Yeah.
those ones turn.
uh, but uh, so you weld those together, and you're effectively locking the your two sides together, your left and right side together, and making effectively what's known as a spool differential. So a spool is what would actually be installed in a vehicle if you just wanted no differential, but ultimately all a spool is just a bar connecting your two half shafts together, basically.
Yep. Yeah.
So spool, I don't know if any outside of probably really really old, like wagons and
Yeah.
like the first cars and stuff. I don't know what cars had spools. I think certain like probably like ATVs and stuff might have spools.
Yeah. Definitely some ATVs do. I've seen them. But I mean, in the commercial world, they're pretty rare.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the ATVs I've seen, um, there's no differential, but when they're that cheap, they're not going to add a spool.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like one solid axle with the actual sprocket just directly attached to this axle bar that goes all the way from the left to the right.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the bigger ones, they maybe have suspension movement, right? So they need half shafts or something. They'll have a spool. I've seen it in a couple Formula cars where their main goal is to reduce weight. Because as you mentioned, all it is, a direct connection from the left to the right end. So it's the lightest option. So if that's your goal, spool's the answer. But you're right, it's definitely pretty uncommon.
Yeah. Yeah. But in drag racing, it works just fine because ultimately you definitely don't want one side slipping over the other. And you're just going in a straight line, and it might chatter. You basically your tires will skip around a little bit when you're driving through the pit lane or through the paddock. But you'll be. It does the job. It keeps the car straight and keeps both wheels spinning. At the same speed, and there's no worry about one slipping and losing some of that very precious forward thrust that you need. In drag racing, which is the only goal of it.
Yeah.
So it's great for drag racing. And I've seen it used also in kind of your cheaper endurance racing or racing in general. I imagine there's drift car bros
It's
that do it
huge
too.
in the drift community, welding them anyway.
Yeah. So, but it does have some downsides. For that, because you're now locking your left and right hand side together, it's going to cause your car to understeer because your car's just going to have a natural resistance to turning because those wheels are now not wanting to turn independently while you're going through the corner. So turn in, you can have some understeer. Turn out can also have some understeer, but it also has this kind of nice effect of almost straightening the car out under power, especially if you use a little bit of toe in. You kind of have those wheels driving together, kind of almost pushing the car to straighten it out because they're both spinning at the same rate, and all naturally the car just wants to be centered, going straight. So. Right. It can help some oversteer problems when exiting corners on high power cars.
It's also very predictable.
Yes, very 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 predictable. I imagine it can cause some tire wear issues because you're kind of sliding kind of one side or the other. I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like it would have some sort of effect on it.
Yeah, you definitely have more scrub for sure.
Yeah. So, but overall, it's even cheaper than an open diff. Unless if you take an open diff and weld it, it's slightly more expensive than open diff because you have to pay for that MIG wire or whatever you use to weld it together.
Yeah.
But But like a spool is the cheapest you can get. It's you get rid of those those spider gears and the center pin and all that stuff, and just have a bar going across. So in terms of racing and like formula cars, like they like you said, they've been seen, and if you already have your open diff that came with your car because you're racing a Dodge Neon or something in ChampCar or whatever, then yeah, you can just weld that together, and you're gonna definitely see a benefit in traction, but potentially some detriment to handling. At least turn-in is going to be a lot more difficult, but your exit will be a lot easier. So
yeah, and I mean, it's worth noting, especially if you're driving around at low speeds, it's gonna wear your parts a lot faster.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, you'll have that tire chirping. What's going to happen is the one of the tires, I think it seems to be the inside most often, is going to stick and then slip. So that the rubber itself is going to wind up and then it's going to slip when these two are directly connected. Because again, they want to spin at different rates, but they can't. So you have this, it's not really binding because the rubber is, taking up that motion. But you have this stick slip sort of condition. And that's just a lot harder on that end. It'll depend on what the weakest point is in the car. But, your axles at least certainly won't enjoy it. So I guess that's worth noting.
Yeah. So. Yeah, definitely one thing to look out for. So yeah, I mean, your spool or your welded open diff kind of they have their places definitely in racing, and but ultimately it's kind of it's just kind of a low cost option to kind of get you out there, maybe get a little more performance. I guess I'd say the next step would be
viscous.
Viscous. So viscous limited slips are also pretty common in road cars. Sometimes they're somewhat advertised in sportier cars, but so with a viscous style, it's using, as the name suggests, using an oil, a fluid, to create that kind of slippage ratio between the input and output. The main problem with a viscous diff is that as that fluid heats up, it's going to lose viscosity, and basically you're going to get closer and closer to an open diff as it gets hotter. So in a racing environment, that's definitely the least favored type of limited slip.
Yeah, and
but
I mean, personally, I'm not a huge fan of them either, just because that fluid is non-Newtonian, so a lot of it comes from how fast it's spinning, right? Is that bias you referenced is directly related to how fast it's spinning, which is the point. It's how it's designed. But if you're concerned about temperature and you want more bias and you need to spin it faster, well, that's not going to help your temperature problem, right?
Yeah.
So,
it's kind of self-defeating.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, where it's good is you're just standard kind of road car driving around in the wet, in the snow.
Yeah,
it's going to be just
especially.
fine. Very common in all-wheel drive cars. So like your Subaru WRX, your I think even like the Mitsubishi Evo, I think at some point they had switched to electronic differentials, at least in the center and maybe the rear. I think Evo 9 had a electronic rear diff, maybe. I can't remember. And then the Evo 10 had two electronic diffs, I think. But which that's kind of a modification of a lot of times of the kind of the clutch style, which we'll get into, I think, next,
Mm-hmm.
where you're just using an electric motor to kind of modify the slippage, like basically adjusting a clutch or something within it to have some electronic way to adjust the bias. But yeah, but viscous, they're definitely very common in like those like 90s and early 2000s all-wheel drive cars. They're relatively low cost compared to your Torsen and your clutch style limited slips, and as far as I can tell, low maintenance and everything. It's just worrying about that fluid, which
Yep.
is just which is what lubricates the gears. It's it's just the diff fluid is also what's doing the viscous coupling. So
Mm-hmm.
as long as you're changing that out, it should be okay. So, but as we said, for racing, it's kind of the almost least appealing option because of that heat problem. I remember talking to someone who they tried in ChampCar to race I think it was a Subaru Legacy, which is all-wheel drive with viscous couplings in at least two of the three diffs, and basically they said the thing just became one-wheel drive after a couple hours, or after like 20 minutes or whatever on track.
Mm-hmm.
And everything got super hot. It's just only one wheel wanted to do anything at that point because it's just having effectively open diffs front, rear, and center, and just
Very frustrating.
not ideal, not ideal. But yeah, I guess the next style we could talk about is your clutch style, your Salisbury, I think is it's sometimes called.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's. Yeah. So everything we've talked about up until now is a torque multiplying diff, right? So you mentioned that ratio quite a few times. It's there's a number that you can multiply one side to the other by to have this torque differential. But also, as you mentioned, when you were reviewing the Quaif or the Torsen, is if one of those tires or wheels didn't have any grip, something times zero is still zero. So you're just kind of out of luck in that case. A clutch style diff, it's standard, or the way to look at it is it's locked until it's not, right? So this is not a torque multiplying diff. What's going to happen is you have, I guess the easiest way to think about it is the left and the right are coupled together with a clutch pack that has some really high preload, right? And so they're effectively locked together until, for some reason, there's such a huge differential of torque between the left and the right that it allows the clutches to slip, right? So this one's my favorite just because of that attitude, right? It's it starts locked, quote unquote locked. This one's a much more racer friendly version. There's a huge downside that the clutches wear. If you have a race car, everything's a wear item, so I guess you probably don't care. But I know for OEs, or some OEs care about this, which is why they wouldn't put clutch styles in their cars they think people are going to track, because they don't want their customers coming back complaining that their clutches are worn out. So that's a very real thing, is your clutches are a wear item. But for racing, you can adjust the preload on the clutches, you can adjust the number of the clutches, ramp angle, things like that, which we'll get into in another podcast when we can illustrate things a little better. But yeah, I guess that's the most basic way to describe how this one works and why I like it anyway. So
yeah, it's definitely definitely the most common for quote unquote real race cars, as you could call them. Yeah, it has a lot of nice factors in that. Yeah, it's locked initially based on that preload. You can adjust that preload. You can adjust your your clutch packs, the number of clutch packs and floating plates you have in there. Um, and then also you can adjust your ramp angle, as you said. So it offers a lot of adjustability, which in racing is very good because a lot of times you got to dial your car in. If you have no way to do that, the more tools you have to adjust, to change the way the car is acting, the better you should be able to get the balance set up. So it's definitely the best for a full on race car, which again it does wear. So, but if it's I mean, like, Formula One cars, they're changing the engine out every couple races, and they'd be doing it every race if the rules didn't make them
Right.
keep it in there. But like, yeah, for prototype, LMP1 teams and DPI teams, like they're having to replace major assemblies in their vehicle and transmissions and all that stuff very often. Having to replace a diff to them is not that big of a concern. But for probably you and me, having to, I mean, it can be just as simple as you need to remove your diff every season and replace the clutches, or maybe every few seasons, depending on how much you race. It's not like you're trashing the diff,
Right.
every couple races, but you have to have those parts ready and plan to do a rebuild every once in a while. And another thing that I also see as far as tuning, and I think we'll probably get more to it in maybe a later episode, but you can also use there's also can be friction modifiers in the oil that can also change that kind of biasing or lockup behavior. So that so different oil manufacturers will also have different oils you can check out. So
Right.
that's one way you can potentially mess with your diff.
Well, and if you have
Without
one of those diffs, you need to have a friction modifier in it.
Yes.
So if you have a clutch style and you're listening to this and you want to change your fluid, even if it's just basic maintenance, you will have diff fluid and the friction modifier that it has to go in. Otherwise, you'll have horrible noises and wear rate coming out of it. So you need that.
So yep. So make sure you're careful with that. But yeah, I mean, I guess those are kind of the major ones, especially in racing. There's a couple other types. Kind of a
Just because it's so similar, let's stop with the electronic LSD.
okay.
And that's all the ones I've seen. I'm not saying nothing else in this world exists, but all the ones I've seen are based off of a clutch style diff. But they use an electric solenoid to control that preload on those clutch packs. And depending on the architecture, they can just bias entirely one direction or another. So that's how you can have an active electronic differential. You have obviously software and vehicle dynamics equations telling you what to do and when, but that's the concept. Is most electronic diffs are changing this preload on the clutch to allow your tires to either rotate separately from each other more easily or to lock them up. And this will feed back into playing a role in like your stability control, for some of those reasons you mentioned before of, how it'll make the car understeer or oversteer, depending on which direction it's going in. So.
Yeah, well, and I guess one thing to look out for is some car manufacturers will advertise they have an electronic diff, But what it really is just it's breaking one axle or one side over the other in order to kind of adjust that, kind of reduce the slip on one side versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like some BMWs and things like that. If you're not getting the M, BMWs that'll say, "Oh, it has an electronic diff," but it's really just it's breaking one side electronically. It was since cars have electronic parking brakes and everything, and ABS and all those sorts of things. Actually, I think it's more on the ABS side,
Yeah.
but basically it's they're using just the brakes to adjust. That's
Yes.
not ideal, and it's going to definitely, in a racing situation, the brakes can get very hot with those types of systems.
Oh, absolutely. There's what you're describing is another method of what a lot of manufacturers have used for torque vectoring.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exactly what this is, right? Except they might also do it on the front for some reason, but they break different axles to like change the car's attitude or behavior, and yeah, that's what they do for dynamics purposes. But I was talking to a gentleman who had I believe it was an ST. It wasn't an RS, and I think only the larger one had torque vectoring, so it would have been a Focus ST. That's if memory serves. I'm not 100% certain.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certain he had an ST, but not 100% certain it was a Focus. But anyways, he talked about having thermal issues a lot, right? He was saying it's a fun car to drive around the track until you get it more than a couple laps in. Then that torque vectoring system just overheating the piss out of your brakes. So for track days, right? Not races, track days, he's going through brake pads every couple of weekends. So that's 20-minute sessions, right? A handful of 20-minute sessions a day, and he's running through brake pads. So he sold the car and bought a Miata because, as we both know, Miatas are the greatest. So,
Yeah.
but
I think I agree with that decision.
yeah, buddy.
But yeah, but also the brakes can sometimes also be used in like stability control programs and things like that. So it's it's effectively they're using an open differential, but then trying to use the brakes kind of to create a little bit of a differential effect. So that's one thing to be careful with. An actual electronic diff is very nice and advanced and is pretty awesome. It might be in a racing situation a little too heavy and to really be super useful. But it could be pretty cool to be able to kind of adjust on the fly. I know with all-wheel drive vehicles, having an electronic center diff is very nice because then you can basically change that torque bias front to rear. So that can help with some of the balance issues that all-wheel drive cars can have.
Yes. So I think you do have to be, or personally, I would be careful about that. Because you're exactly right. In some cars, you can change that torque bias, in 10% increments or whatever, right? So you can have an all-wheel drive car that's mostly rear wheel, right? And that's sweet. But a lot of cars today, mostly for emissions, have a clutched center diff, but it's reversed from what we're talking about. So it's always open until the clutch engages and sends power to the rear.
Yes.
So your all-wheel drive car is really a front-wheel drive car 90% of the time. And then generally just because of use case, they don't size that center diff to be able to transfer even half right? I think there's
Hmm.
some Audis, like the lower end ones, the cheaper ones, or cheaper Audi, whatever, um, where it's not going to send more than 30% of the power to the rear, which is pretty lame in my opinion. But I mean, they have fuel economy and emissions requirements to meet, so I get why it happens, and it is more efficient, especially for how most people use their car. It's just more boring too. So,
Yeah.
but if you want to talk about some of those like weird, generally not used diffs.
Yeah. So as another, I'd say I think it's one of the earlier like kind of differential designs that was come up with, which is the Cam and Paul. And this is kind of another. So this is it's almost it's kind of like it's just a locking differential where it's open until it locks up. But in this case, it's using Paul's. Also, it can also be called as chiclets in a carrier, and based on that kind of that difference in speed between the wheels, it'll I believe it pushes the side face of the Pauls into the kind of notches of the outer kind of cam housing, and locks it up that way. So the nice thing about a Cam and Paul, and these are I think pretty often found in ATVs, as well as Formula SAE cars, is
Pretty much
sometimes.
cheap and light
Um,
ish. So,
yeah. Um, what's nice about these is that they have a very kind of predictable locking up uh, kind of they lock up predictably. So they'll just kind of lock together and then unlock once you're coming out of the corner, or coming into the corner will be open, so you don't have that understeer that a spool has. But then coming out, it'll lock, and then you'll. I think a lot of times you'll feel it, but then you'll power out pretty nicely. So you can always kind of expect where it's going to lock up. And yeah, and then effectively you have the nice advantage of an open diff and corner entry and a lock diff coming out. I know the biggest downside of these, my understanding is wear, since it's similar to kind of like a dog box transmission. You're ultimately relying on kind of metal to metal contact to for your differential to work. And so because of that, eventually the pawls will wear out, and you have to replace them, and then eventually the actual kind of outer track, outer cam track will wear out too, and you have to replace that whole, basically almost the whole diff assembly. So
yeah,
as far as wear, definitely not the best for say Formula SAE, where they're racing once or twice a year,
no,
and
it's not a
the
problem.
cars weigh 300 pounds, and yeah, and it shouldn't be a problem. Whereas I don't think I've ever seen this really used in like
Anything else?
race, like non-Formula SAE race cars.
Yeah, I've never seen it used that way. Um,
So, but no, they exist, and it's another style that you could try, I guess.
yeah,
But yeah, maybe only. Hmm.
I was just gonna say, so that you have the Pauls slide against each other, and the inner and the outer um, ends of that. It's not really a case. Both have those cam profiles, so that's how they lock, right? Is they bind on the outside as well as the inside. Um,
Hmm.
what's interesting though is putting it into real world use, I guess, so to speak. Um, is there's a bevel washer, um, and I believe that's going to be holding like the pawl carrier to the rest of the assembly. So you have the outer track, the inner track, and this thing that holds the pawls. In a Formula car, because my team, at least at a couple points, did the basic bitch move of using this out of a Honda ATV. It's a very common approach. Though we had a drive shaft, so very uncommon there. Thank you. But we were chasing lots of dynamics problems, just based off of driver feel. And as it turns out, that bevel washer was thick enough, like it's standard. Honda sized it properly for their use, right? And I guess it's probably because there's a lot more reaction with a heavier ATV in mud. Crazy. But it had so much preload that our tires were always locked. It might as well have just been a solid. We could have just used a spool, So I guess that's something to pay attention to, is that bevel washer is generally not looked at as a tuning tool. And sure enough, you're only going to have, I suppose you could have a bunch of different ones, but what we did is we just cut it down until it was about as thin as aluminum foil. And then that diff actually worked as how you described. It did its job finally. But yeah, I guess just something to think about too is, especially in that specific usage, but just in general, there's the way things are assembled. Something might be affecting the tuning when it's not really meant to be a tuning tool. It's just whatever's using your preload or part in assembly might be affecting it. So it's something to think about.
Yeah. But they're definitely cam and pawl, not the most common.
No.
I mean, if it wasn't for Formula SE, I don't think I'd know about it.
Same.
But I guess another type that is common, but maybe not in kind of road course racing and everything, is the Detroit locker. The way this works is actually kind of similar to the clutch pack style in that it's normally its normal operation is locked. And then by turning the wheels in different direction, it unlocks. But instead of using a clutch, it's kind of using almost like kind of some cones and a spring, sort of. It's basically it's kind of a clutch, but it's not like your normal kind of friction material clutch. It's kind of using, like I said, like springs that then disengage when enough. Basically enough resistance is applied from one side to the other. So,
yeah, I guess I would think of it as a very, very aggressive cam profile, right? So it's, as sort of a lot of the things we've mentioned, they bind, unless you have this overwhelming differential between the two, and then, it's smooth enough to disengage. Sort of, right?
Yeah. So these are very common in drag racing because again, I think it was really that's where it was kind of come up with is for drag racing, so that you can effectively have that spool or welded diff, but then when you go to turn around at the end of the the quarter mile run, then you're not having that extra kind of driveline shock from it slipping as it's trying to go around the corners, like unloading and loading, as we said before. So again, a great option for drag racing, but maybe not the best for road course racing. My understanding is it'll operate like a spool at turn in. It'll then basically at some point it'll lock up, or I guess no, sorry, it'll kind of act as an open diff in turn-in, because there's enough bias there as you're turning in to cause it to unlock. But once you are kind of in mid corner and not really applying much power, it'll then lock up again, and you'll kind of have that mid corner understeer. So it has some nice qualities in that it does lock under power, and it's locked under power. But then it has some downsides as far as kind of road course racing. So outside of it needing to be used in your kind of rule set or something, I don't really see a huge need to use it over the cheaper spool or welded diff option.
Right.
So there's that's most different types. The last type I've run into was actually in our Volvo Lemon / ChampCar car. So the car originally, it had I can't remember what it's an Eaton, some sort of Eaton e-locker. No, it's not an e-locker. Let me look this up real quick. But it has a, let's see. So it has a M locker, as it's called, a G80 mechanically locking differential. So the way this works is the basis of it is very similar to it operates as an open differential most of the time, but then it also has a clutch pack, which will lock the wheels when there's so it's I guess it's kind of different than a clutch pack in that it's not locked. It's disengaged. It only locks when there's a difference in speed there. But then the other trick of it is that it has, in order to reduce wear of the clutch, it has a kind of a lockout system for the clutch, that at a certain speed, basically as it's rotating, there's this kind of I don't know, it's kind of like a pawl that moves out of the way as it's rotating, just from the centrifugal force, and prevents that clutch system from activating if there's difference in wheel speed. So the whole point of this is that it's really just meant for your icy, snowy situations, low traction, where if there's a difference in wheel speed, it'll lock the clutches together. The clutches will lock the wheels together, and then you'll have good traction in your Volvo station wagon, getting up a hill or something. But outside of that, in order to reduce clutch wear, it'll basically disengage that clutch system and just be a normal open differential at any higher speeds, like above, I think it's 10 or 12 miles an hour, maybe 20. But so relatively low, very low speeds, especially in racing, you'll really never see 20 mile an hour, at least in road course racing.
So it sounds like anti-VTEC for your diff, right? You spin fast enough and now you stop having fun.
Yes, basically.
Okay.
So we ran it as it came, and the problem we were always having is it was just basically an open diff in racing situations, and we'd have a lot of one wheel peels coming out of corners. You'd have to wait till the car is basically perfectly straight to apply the power to get it to stop it from just spinning the wheels, and it was definitely hurting our lap time by quite a bit. So instead of, I don't know, finding some way to shoehorn a Torsen or something into it, which it's a solid rear axle, so it's pretty interesting setup that it has, being a, I don't know, kind of a station wagon, but it's almost more like a truck in some ways. But because I believe this diff is also used in like the Silverado and some other vehicles, in order to create that, allow for better operation in icy situations. But yeah, so we took a look at the diff, and we looked at, we did some research on it and tried to figure out how we could make this better. And So the easy solution was just to weld that pawl that kind of moves away from the clutch system in order to, it basically disengages that clutch system. We welded it in place basically so it couldn't move, and now effectively we had that locking the clutch activating at any speed. So through 2 seasons of racing with it, not too often, the car doesn't really race as often as I wish it would, but when it does get out there, it for the races it did, we never wore it out, at least fully, not yet. We've gone through transmissions more than that so far, but yeah, it had this really interesting behavior where it wouldn't lock immediately as you're exiting the corner. The car would start to drift a little, it'd spin up one, and then you'd feel and almost hear a clunk. I think you can almost hear it, but basically it would clunk, and then all of a sudden the car would just hold kind of the angle that it was at. So you could do some pretty nice kind of predictable drifts with it. It was pretty fun, but yeah, it was worth a couple seconds a lap at Gingerman, which is, if you're going to find seconds a lap, it's got to be at Gingerman.
Yeah. Sub 140 yet?
No. Damn. The Volvo is not sub 140. We were more excited when it was sub 150. That was the big achievement.
Our shit.
But, for a 150,000 mile, straight six Volvo probably was almost 3,800 pounds or something.
Mm-hmm.
I think we got it down to 30 or 2,400 because the whole rear wagon part was all kind of cut off. So now it looks like a pickup truck. But some serious lightweighting and some diff tweaks and suspension tweaks and aero, super effective aero.
Very, very ineffective aero.
It got into the 40s, so we were pretty stoked about that, starting with a car that was struggling in the mid to high 50s. So but anyway, that's another style that kind of kind of stumbled across. But I'm sure there's a lot more just of big companies that came up with, or maybe even small companies too, that came up with wacky different types of diffs. But ultimately, the main ones we talked about are the ones, at least in racing, you're going to find most common. So yeah, for the most part, like your clutch style is again going to be popular for race cars because of all the different adjustments you have. Then you also have your Torzens or your Quifes or just basically your ATB, your automatic torque biasing differentials. Those are going to be very nice for basically most track and race cars that don't need the fine adjustment, and relatively you don't have to worry, low wear. You don't have to worry about replacing clutches and everything. And then if you can make an open diff work, then more power to you. Otherwise, welding it could definitely yield some lap time and maybe some higher power cars. But ultimately the Torsen or the clutch style is going to be the best, the ideal way to go. But yeah, I guess, is there anything else you can think of?
I guess I would leave with the parting comment on diffs, at least an intro to diffs, as please go to the YouTubes and you'll find a video. If you can search for how a diff works, differentials, around the corner is the name of the video. It will definitely come up, but there's an old video from 1937 put out by someone in the auto industry. I don't remember who. I've heard it was GM. I heard it was SAE. I don't know who made the video. It was made in 1937. But it's fantastic.
Oh yeah.
I go back sometimes just for a refresher because Um, Even though I can mathematically understand a diff, um, watching them is still somewhat magical. You know, I mean, I'm a little silly saying that, but like, put your car in the air and spin one of the tires, and the other tire will spin the opposite direction if you have an open diff, right? If it's locked, they'll spin the same direction. Uh,
Hmm.
it's just mind blowing, right? To actually, like, it's a simple concept, or simple enough, but um, still, every once in a while, I find myself getting lost, and I'm like, wait a minute, how does that work again? What's going to be the load path? So please, if you're interested, the best base you can get is watching this video. Again, it's called Around the Corner. How differential steering works. It was made in 1937, so it's probably the only black and white video on YouTube under differentials. But it's a great video. The guy's got kind of a funny accent, and they really break it down pretty simply. So um, I think I've got nothing else crazy for you. Just recommend watching that, and I might post it on one of our socials somewhere just so it's easier to find. But,
Hmm. Yeah, it's I don't know. I think the hand motions and everything, they're just so smooth. Like the whole, it's just, I don't know. The whole video is just kind of mesmerizing.
it's great, right? Because he has like those old toys. I forgot what they were, but you have like those discs that look like cheese wheels, and they had sticks coming out of them and stuff. And so like
Hmm.
they just break it down so simply, and you can see like if your ring gear had one tooth every 90 degrees, it had four teeth total, you can see how that would look and how that actually does transfer motion to the other wheel. And then they start breaking it down with more spokes and how that turns into gears, which feeds back into your design of offset and gear noise and whatever. But I love that video. I can't recommend it enough. So
Yeah, but otherwise, that kind of that covers, I guess, intro to diffs. One thing, I guess, real quick, I wanted to talk about was well, we mentioned it last week that ChampCar Daytona was was the coming weekend, but now last weekend. And that's kind of, I think, the first big race. The first, I mean, I think sellout, I believe, was 120, at least 120 cars signed up. So it's, and it's Daytona, so it's always going to bring a lot of people.
mhm.
But yeah, I mean, we had some interesting results. Like, I think I was expecting the now BBY Racing Ultima to be up there, since it was the winner last year. But it looks like they had an issue really early. I haven't gotten to talk to Paul yet about it, but it's unfortunate to see. I mean, especially in those kind of race formats, just a single 14 hour, you can't really get it fixed and get it back out there. You're kind of done for the weekend. But and then the good, bad, and the ugly Riley Motorsports Corvette. Looks like they made some changes based on some of the extra points they got from last year. Still super fast. I think they were taking some penalty laps too. But it looks like they also had some sort of issue. They didn't finish the race. And then the crowd control Mustang that's usually up at the front there, I think they had a crash. So kind of the big three that I was expecting to be on the podium were out relatively early, and yeah, I left it to actually a team I raced with, Team Infinity, in the good old Shark car. They were able to take the win, which is really awesome to see. They're basically an OG of ChampCar days. They've been around longer than, I don't know, basically almost every team that I know of. If Bill Strong actually raced his car, I would say maybe Bill Strong's been there longer. I don't know, but he doesn't. So, but they took the win, and with all the speed and cost creep we've talked about before, it's good to see a team that's definitely a more budget team that's been around for a while. See them competing out there and taking the win. It didn't appear to be a win initially because the Rentec Porsche was able to was finished in the lead, but it sounds like they some parts were found in tech that were unclaimed, so they added some points to the car and adjusted their position to fifth. So yeah, still waiting on the deets of exactly what they found on that car, but yeah, it's really happy to see Infinity take the win. Ed's a really nice guy, and I think he definitely deserves it. So, but yeah, I think otherwise I can't remember the rest of the finishing order, but I think the BBY Racing Boxster got third. Actually, I'll just look it up while I'm talking here. But yeah, I mean, I would have liked to go on there this year. I probably should have made a little more effort since NASA Nationals is there, and although it wouldn't be in my Miata, it would still probably be good to see the track again. But it's quite a it's a bit of a drive, or ideally a fly, but
Right.
but yeah. But yeah, I guess Team London got second in an E34. Interesting. But yeah, but anyway, it is interesting to see the ruling after finding some extra points. They didn't DQ the team. In the past, the precedent was kind of set that that if any unclaimed parts were found, you'd be DQ'd even if you'd still be under 500 with those parts. And then now, I think after the good, bad, and the ugly incident, since they didn't DQ him, I think it would, now that they set that precedent, it would be kind of bad for them to DQ that team. So I guess it's good that they're I guess I don't like that they shifted that direction, but I guess it's okay that now they're being consistent. So but otherwise, it didn't seem like too much other drama. We always love the drama. Everyone loves the drama, but
Of course.
definitely around here at Motorsports Tech Talk, we love drama. But anyway, so that kind of covers. We just wanted to cover that real quick, but yeah. Otherwise, that kind of. I think that's all for today. As always, make sure you check out our social medias, our Facebook and our Instagram, for we'll always announce when the episodes will come up. Maybe some little extra content here and there. I still need to post up my last Spec Miata race video, so I'll probably be putting those up this week. But yeah, otherwise, thanks again for sticking with us this long, and we hope to talk to you guys again soon.
See ya.